Hello, everyone. It's Philip Lee returning with another episode of Civil War Chat. Today is Monday, the 12th of September, 2022. Click on the subscribe button here in the lower right to subscribe to future episodes, and also the notification bell in the far upper right to be notified when they're released. Today's topic is Texas Senator John Regan was right. And what really triggered this is the realization that there's a great rush among the academia and the media to condemn particularly the Southern conduct in the Reconstruction era for its racism. And it's what annoys me is it's typically done with a smugness that implies that, well, my ancestors north of the Ohio River and the Mason-Dixon line, they would never have done anything like that, even in similar circumstances. But I think that that case is, I think they're wrong about that. I think we can look at some similar circumstances and see that the evidence is pretty overwhelming that they would have objected just as strenuously as the Southerners did to such an abrupt change in their state government. So I wrote it down here to get sort of get my thoughts concise and clear, coherent on this. So let me proceed with that. Now, Texas Senator John Regan was right when he argued in the chamber 3 months before the opening shots at Fort Sumter. He said, suppose the people of the South would today voluntarily surrender $3 billion in slave property and send their slaves at their expense to the free states. Would you accept them as freemen and citizens of your state? You dare not answer me that you would. You would fight us with all of your energy and power for 20 years. Reagan is right about that. Truer words were never spoken, but only rarely are they spoken by modern college historians or their media acolytes. They seldom disclose that Blacks compose only 2% of the antebellum populations among the free states where slavery was illegal. And 94% of that 2% could not vote. The month before President Lincoln announced his Emancipation Proclamation, commonly identified with freeing the slaves, his home state of Illinois voted 5-1 against Black suffrage, even though Blacks composed a mere 0.4% of her population. So what that means is Illinois had 4 Blacks per 1,000 population, and they voted in August of 1862 5-1 against giving that minority the right to vote in their state. 5-1. While Southern racism was sometimes undeniably violent during Reconstruction, there's no denying that. Would it have been any different at the North under similar circumstances? Let's consider that question carefully. Would Northerners have acquiesced if their state governments had been seized by corrupted interlopers who manipulated a decisive voting bloc of illiterate immigrants with no experience in self-government? Since, as noted, Blacks represented only 2% of the free state population, history provides no direct comparison. And the historians are delighted with that because they can smugly assert that, well, the northern states wouldn't have been anything like that. But let's consider a case that is applicable, that is similar. That would be California's anti-Asian racism that lasted until 1959. California's whites often hated, mistreated, and marginalized for Chinese Americans. They accounted for 2/3 of the state's lynch victims between 1849 and 1902. Thus, Chinese Americans were killed in lynchings twice as often as the people of all other races. In fact, America's biggest single lynching happened in Los Angeles in 1871, when 19 Chinese Americans were killed, and including one woman. Although Chinese Americans never represented more than 10%, they never represented more than 10% of California's population. Almost none were able to obtain the right to vote during the 19th century. In contrast, Blacks composed 40% of the population in the former Confederate states, where they gained suffrage abruptly by comparison, less than 3 years after the war ended. Moreover, following Republican-controlled voter registrations, Blacks composed a majority of voters in Louisiana, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, and South Carolina, while Georgia was split about evenly. Republicans got control of Tennessee, Arkansas, and North Carolina through a combination of Black suffrage and ex-Confederate disfranchisement, typically through restrictive allegiance oaths. In other words, they would be, a good case was in Missouri, where if they had to pledge allegiance to the United States and to the state government in Missouri, if they had anything to do with the Confederacy, they could not, take the pledge, because that would be a condition that violated the terms of the pledge. Even though Missouri was not a Confederate, not one of the 11 Confederate states, but there were quite a number of Confederates that came from Missouri, because it was really a border state that was split by the war. Even though Asian Americans would obviously never gain control of California, the state's politicians prevailed upon the federal government to pass a string of anti-Asian laws. First, the 1870 Naturalization Act that permitted, quote, African or African descent, close quote, peoples, immigrants specifically, to become naturalized citizens. It excluded Asians deliberately. Second, Congress passed in 1875 the Page Act that basically blocked Chinese women from immigrating at a time when 95% of the Chinese Americans were male. Chinese Americans could not become naturalized citizens until 1943, when some of them were fighting in World War II. And that happened because of a bill sponsored in the Senate by a Southern Democrat. Did not happen because of anything in California. A series of federal Chinese exclusion acts designed to reduce the number of Asian residents followed the Page Act. The first, in 1882, stopped Chinese immigrants for a decade. It stopped Chinese immigration for a decade. Then in 1892, the Geary Act extended the exclusion for another decade. And in 1904, the exclusion acts were made permanent. In 1925, even the Chinese wives of American citizens were denied entry into the United States. Consequently, as late as 1950, Asian Americans represented less than 2% of California's population, compared to 9% in 1880. Finally, this is interesting. While the 14th Amendment effectively brought Black suffrage to the South in 1868, California did not ratify it until almost a century later. And that's because the 14th Amendment would automatically bestow citizenship on the offspring of Chinese Americans born in the USA, including California. Meanwhile, at the state level, in 1905, California passed a miscegenation law which outlawed Chinese and white intermarriage. Notwithstanding the results, this one's a good one too, consider this, notwithstanding the results of the Civil War, the state's Supreme Court ruled in 1870 that the 14th Amendment did not apply to California because California was a, quote, sovereign state, close quote. California basically nullified with impunity a part of the U.S. Constitution it did not like. And there's not much difference really there between what California's Supreme Court did and what Orville Faubus did when he sent the Arkansas National Guard to stop the integration of Central High in Little Rock. The only difference is that the U.S. government did not challenge California. They let them get away with that racism. That somehow never gets into the media. Well, maybe rarely if somebody's doing an article on Chinese Americans. But, you know, it's clearly an example of, you know, ignoring the authority, the higher authority of the federal government. Okay, so in conclusion, just imagine the violence that would have occurred in the northern states or in California specifically if, you know, Chinese Americans took over and white Californians, despite being a majority of the population, found that they were under the thumb of a puppet regime that depended upon the votes from Chinese immigrants. Well, I think you can, you know, I think you can let me, yeah, I think you know what the result would be. So let me share this with you. This is my book, U.S. Grants Failed Presidency. So much of what I'm talking about happened, or so much of what the Reconstruction period happened during Grant's failed presidency. This book is going to provide you a lot of information that you're not going to get from the academics or the media. You're just not going to get it. So if you want to get it, this is the place to get it. It's $22 at Amazon. If you want an autographed copy from me, it's $26. I'll cover the postage, but email me, Phil, PHIL_Lee, LEIGH @me.com. Okay, that is our show for today. And I want to thank you for watching. And I look forward to seeing you next time.